Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Mallard here, and this lesson, Unit 10, Lesson 5, is going to cover plant adaptations and the four major plant groups. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to tell me what the four major plant groups are, examples of plants that would fall in those categories, and some of the adaptations that have allowed those plants to survive as well. So first of all, let's go ahead and review what the term adaptations means. So adaptation is any trait that helps an organism to survive. And remember, when we talked about natural selection, the goal is to survive. When you survive, you have a greater chance of reproducing. And when you reproduce, the hope is that you pass on that trait to your offspring. So adaptations can be structural, which means it could be a part that you have. It could be a color. It could be that you have horns. It could be that you have wings. All right, those are things that are structural. Behavioral are adaptations that has to do with how an organism behaves. And so you already have gone over some animal behaviors. And so today we're really going to be primarily focusing on structural adaptations that plants have that have allowed plants to survive. So here's an example. This is a mirror orchid, and when you look at it, it kind of resembles a insect. It actually is supposed to resemble a female wasp, and so with these mirror orchids, they look like a female insect, and so of course the males are going to come along and they're going to actually try to mate with this flower because it looks like a female. But in doing so, they actually will get pollen on them, and then eventually they'll get frustrated and move on to another plant that they also think is a female. And in doing so, they are helping to transfer pollen from one plant to the next. So this is a structural adaptation for this particular flower that has allowed it to survive because it attracts pollinators. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through each of the four major plant groups. So let me just pronounce these. The first group is bryophytes. The second one is pterophytes. The third one is gymnosperms, and the last group are the angiosperms. So we're going to talk about each one of these groups from an evolutionary standpoint. Out of these four groups, the bryophytes were kind of the first one to evolve. Pterophytes were next, gymnosperms, and then angiosperms were the last plant group. Before we get into the plant group, I want to review what the term vascular means. All right, so way back when we did photosynthesis in plants, we talked about plants have tubes that transport water. Remember, we have to have water for photosynthesis. That water is going to come from the roots, and the roots are going to get that from water that is in the soil and in the ground. So xylem, these are the tubes that transport water up the stem. The other tubes are called phloem, and remember, phloem transports food. Remember, photosynthesis is going to take place in the leaves of a plant, and so when photosynthesis takes place and it makes glucose, that glucose has to be transported to other parts of the plant, and it's the phloem that is involved in transporting that food. So if a plant has the xylem and phloem in it, that means that it is a vascular plant. It has tubes for transporting water and transporting food. Our first group are the bryophytes. These are sometimes also referred to as non-vascular. So because they are non-vascular, they do not have xylem to transport water, and they do not have phloem to transport food. All right, so they don't have xylem to transport water, they don't have phloem to transport food, and so these particular plants will usually live in damp environments so that they can get water through diffusion. And the other thing is, because they don't have a way to transport food and water, they don't grow very tall. In fact, those of you who are familiar with moss, they basically just grow on the ground. Okay. The other thing about our bryophytes or our mosses is that they reproduce using spores. All right, so spores are their way of reproducing. All right, our next step up kind of from evolution is going from our mosses or our bryophytes to our next set of plants, which are called the pterophytes. Our step up here is that these are plants that are vascular. So ferns, for example, are pterophytes. Ferns have xylem to transport water, and they also have phloem to transport food. Because of that, ferns can obviously they grow taller than mosses. Mosses stay on the ground, but ferns actually are able to grow taller. So this is the one thing that distinguishes this group from our bryophytes. However, as far as reproduction goes, they continue to reproduce the same way using spores. And sometimes when you're in the woods, you can flip over the fern and you can see the little spore cases on the back of the leaf of the fern. All right, the next big step up kind of in evolution with our plant groups is we are now going to move to plants that reproduce using seeds. All right, so that's sort of a step up going from a spore to a seed. And so our next group are called the gymnosperms. Literally, the term sperm means seed, and the gymno part, that prefix there is naked. So literally this group that translates to naked seed. Um, the reason why it's called naked seed is that these particular plants, they produce seeds on a cone. And when the cone opens up, the seed is literally just kind of sitting on the edge there. And when the wind blows the tree or the tree shakes, the seed will fall out. So once the pine cone opens up, the seed's no longer covered. So that's why it's called naked seed, because the seed's not really protected once that cone opens up there. Any sort of plant that produces a cone is classified as a gymnosperm. So in North Carolina, we have an abundant amount of pine trees. So all of your pine trees are going to be classified as gymnosperms. Notice I put next to it that gymnosperms are vascular. So gymnosperms are going to contain xylem and phloem. So they have ways to transport water and food. And once again, pine trees, they grow very tall, and they have that ability to transport food and water using the xylem and phloem. All right, so gymnosperms are different from our ferns in that they produce seeds. We're going to go to our next group that also is a seed producing group. And our last and final group are called the angiosperms. So literally that root term angio means a vessel or container, because with angiosperms, the seed is actually covered or protected by some sort of fruit. Okay, so that's what we mean by a vessel or container. So these seeds are actually going to be found inside of a fruit. This particular group, once again, it reproduces with seeds. It's vascular. All right, so it has xylem and phloem. Out of all of the groups, this group is the most successful from an evolutionary standpoint because, one, it produces flowers. Flowers, they're usually colored. They usually like look nice. They smell nice. All of these traits are going to attract pollinators. So whether we're talking about bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, for example, the flowers attract pollinators, and the pollinators have basically helped these organisms reproduce, this plant group reproduce. The other thing is after the flower is fertilized, okay, so pollen from one plant goes to another plant, then we say the flower is fertilized. The plant will now be able to produce a fruit. Okay, so think about things that you find seeds. So you find seeds inside of an apple, for example, but we have seeds inside of tomatoes. So technically, tomatoes, from a biology standpoint, are fruits. Seeds inside of cucumbers. Cucumbers start off as a flower that's bloomed. It gets fertilized, and the seeds are in a fruit, and that's a cucumber. Same thing. The list can go on and on. Peppers, cantaloupe, pumpkins. These are all things that there's seeds inside of them. Now, the fruit that's produced helps with seed dispersal. And this is another reason why angiosperms are the most successful group. They produce seeds inside of fruit, and so the fruit is usually colorful. It provides food, so animals will eat on the fruit, and in doing so, sometimes the seeds will fall out. In the case of berries, you might have a bird that eats the whole berry, and then when the bird poops, it not only poops but also poops the seed out, and that helps the dispersal of the seed. So, out of all of our groups, angiosperms are the most successful because of the flowers and the fruit that it produces. This group is the largest group out of all four. And from an evolutionary perspective, this particular group has various adaptations that have allowed for it to be so successful. So hopefully by now, you should be able to recognize some examples of the four different plant groups. Hopefully as well, you should know the difference between vascular versus non-vascular plants. And also as a review, understand the difference between the function of xylem and phloem.